Good evening. Good evening and welcome to St. Edward's University. My name is Richard Bouch. I'm a professor and assistant dean in the School of Arts and Humanities. We are gathered for the Most Reverend John McCarthy Lecture on the Catholic Church in the 21st century, and this evening's lecture will be illuminating. Dr. Robin Jensen is here to speak about how artists through the centuries have interpreted biblical texts and shaped the ways that we imagine our sacred stories. Dr. Jensen is an expert in visual exegesis, and her work draws not only upon scripture and theology, but as well art history, design and architecture, classics, medieval studies. Her innovative approach to studying early Christian sources is very 21st century. As a theologian myself, I can say that Dr. Jensen's work, her scholarship, is groundbreaking. We also welcome the friends who are here on the live stream. We are glad that you have joined us virtually from California to the East Coast and many points in between. To those of you working and serving in Holy Cross schools and universities, a most warm welcome to you. Ave Crux Spes Unica. In a moment, Dr. Montserrat Fuentes, the president of St. Edward's University, will introduce our speaker, Dr. Jensen. Now, we pause to respectfully acknowledge that St. Edward's University sits on the land of the Comanche and the Apache peoples, as well as the Cohiwacan and the Tonkawa peoples. We remember their continued connection to this region and give thanks to them for allowing us to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. We pay our respects to elders, past and present. We recognize the grave harm and injustices brought by colonialism, not only to indigenous peoples, but also to those of African identity who were stolen from their homes and enslaved, even on our campus. We grieve the vast loss of life, languages, and traditions. We deeply regret our own community's role in slavery, segregation, and in upholding systemic racism. As a Holy Cross institution of education and transformation, we seek to learn, reconcile, and bring healing by addressing the wrongs of the past and acting now and in the future to bring about a better time. Thank you. Now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Fuentes, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. So I'm Montse Fuentes, and I have the privilege of serving as president of this wonderful institution, St. Edward's. And I'm so pleased to have the opportunity today to welcome all of you to the Most Reverend John McCarthy Lecture at St. Edward's University, named for the longtime bishop in Austin, John McCarthy. This lecture series on the Catholic Church in the 21st century is a great opportunity for us to bring national speakers and to recognize them, bringing them here to our St. Edward's Austin campus. I'm so honored today to be able to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robin Jensen. When we think about the Catholic Church in the 21st century, the innovative interdisciplinary research that Dr. Jensen is doing lies at the forefront. Her many publications and her lectures, such as the one presented tonight, examine the ways that the visual images and architectural spaces serve as modes of theological expression. Dr. Robin Jensen is the Patrick O'Brien Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. She assumed her current position at Notre Dame in 2015, and prior to that, she held professorships at Vanderbilt University and Boston College. Dr. Jensen exemplifies the interdisciplinary approach to theology. She holds joint appointments in the departments of art, art history, and design. She's concurrent faculty in classics and a fellow in the Medieval Institute at the University of Notre Dame. Very impressive. Dr. Jensen's research and publications focus on the educational and on the scholarship and the relationship between early Christian art and literature. Her published essays and books open our eyes to the ways that visual images interpret sacred texts, enhance liturgical settings, and reflect the nature and the content of devotional piety. We look forward to this evening's lecture with an abundance of striking images that provide inroads to theological reflection. Dr. Jensen is the author of numerous articles and books, most notably The Cross, History, Art, and Controversy. Also, Christianity in Roman Africa, the development of its practices and beliefs, and Living Water, images, symbols, and settings of early Christian baptism. Dr. Jensen's current project, tentatively titled From Idols to Icons, examines the emergence of Christian material piety in the 4th and 5th centuries. Please join me in offering a very warm welcome to our speaker tonight, Dr. Robin Jensen.
It's a huge honor to be here, and I thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm happy to be in another Holy Cross school. I'm going to, before I retire, I want to make a pilgrimage to all of them. So I was at Portland a year ago, and this is really an honor to be here. So thank you so much for this invitation. And I'm going to read a paragraph or so to start off, and then I'm going to just turn and talk to you rather than reading. But let me read this little paragraph I wrote up this morning. Through history, the Church has valued visual and pictorial art for many reasons and used it to accomplish many purposes. Artists beautify the spaces of worship, delight the eyes of the faithful, inspire their spirits, and illuminate their sacred stories. Art helps to create sacred surroundings by means of the colored light streaming through stained glass and dappling the interior of a sanctuary. The woven threads of tapestries adorn the altar area, and the sculpted figures in niches along the walls and surrounding the entrances welcome us. This visual array offers an aesthetic experience that can rival the sound of a choir and similarly prompt worshipers to participate more fully in the transcendent dimensions of the liturgy. Words cannot really describe these experiences very well. They are, in many ways, inexplicable. We simply know that our senses are awakened. We are moved emotionally and enlightened intellectually and inspired spiritually. And all this is done by figures rather than words, and images rather than texts, heard and read. So I often start a class in asking my students, what does art do? And here is a few ideas I have. This is not exhaustive, and these are not exclusive. But I'm going to go through these very quickly and show you some ways that I think that art works for the Church. The first is a kind of pedagogical or didactic approach, art as a visual aid for teaching the faith. The second I call doxological or inspirational, art as wordless praise. And then, maybe very familiar to many people, art as iconic or devotional. Art as an instrument for mediating an encounter with the holy, very true of our Orthodox brothers and sisters. But tonight, we're going to spend much more time talking about art as exegetical, art as a vehicle for narrating and interpreting our sacred stories. But I'll run through these very quickly so you have examples of what I mean. So here is an example, I sort of sometimes think, of art as didactic. And this is a center of a silver platter from around the beginning of the 6th century. And it shows you a sort of symbol system that we might recognize. The cross is a trinity. So the cross represents Christ. The hand coming from the sky is the hand of God. It represents the voice, sometimes also of God, and of course the dove of the Holy Spirit. At the bottom are two lambs. One could identify them possibly as the Virgin Mary and the beloved disciples at the foot of the cross. And the cross is standing on a hillock that has 4 rivers flowing from it to remind us of the Garden of Eden. So it's already trying to teach us something. And of course, the Alpha and the Omega are hanging from the crossbar of the cross also to identify that wonderful line. He is the beginning and the end. A much less beautiful example. This is from my husband's home parish in New Iberia, Louisiana, and I snuck this photograph kind of over his objections, but it's very didactic, right? So it also tries to teach the Trinity. God is and God is not these things, and God is all of these things. So this is actually in the sanctuary ceiling in St. Peter's Parish in New Iberia, Louisiana. So it's just a sort of a parallel, modern parallel to that. I sometimes think of this one as pedagogical or didactic in another kind of way. And this is a famous painting in the National Gallery in London, and it's by Diego Velázquez. And it's training the Christian soul of how to contemplate Christ. And so you see this beautiful image of this angel instructing the little human soul in this blue nightie how to exchange glances with Christ, the suffering Christ. So this reminds me very much of sort of medieval training of people to be in devotional respect toward the image of the crucifix. And though this is a very powerful image for me, in fact, the sort of exchange of these glances are very important in this image. Now, if I move on quickly, and we're going to see a lot of art, and we don't have a lot of time, so you'll have to come back and ask me to repeat some of these when you want to see. But this is by a wonderful one of his last works by a contemporary artist who just recently died. His name is John August Swanson. He was actually a student of Sister Carita Kent, if anybody remembers Sister Carita. He was her tech guy and her student. And he lived in California. He did a lot of beautiful serigraphs, and this one has about 190 colors, which he means 190 screens that he put together to make this beautiful image. And I just think of this as pure praise. This is just outright and beautiful, praiseworthy, inspirational imagery. This one, I forgot to give you a date on this one, but Sandro Botticelli's Mary and the Childless Singing Angels. It's in Berlin, so it'd be 15th century. And there's a story about this one that I love to tell, but this actually is a very famous painting, and for one interesting reason, among others, but this was a painting that sort of converted the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich. He saw this first in the trenches of World War I as a soldier in a magazine and made an effort to go see it in person in Berlin after he went on furlough. And I actually have a quote. Maybe I'll read a little bit of what he said. He wrote something in Parade magazine in 1955 about this painting, and here's what he says. Beauty itself shone through the colors of the paint as the light of the day shone through the stained glass windows of a medieval church. I turned away shaken. I know now, he says, that the picture is not the greatest I've seen since then, but the moment of ecstasy has never been repeated. So those of you who know about Paul Tillich know that he also became the great theologian of culture. And interestingly, almost always then left behind fairly traditional pictorial art and began to be very interested in the abstract. This is another instance, I think, for me, of doxological or art. And not everybody likes it, as I do, but it's in France. It's a tapestry that covers a sanctuary, and it's the image of the apocalypse of Revelation. So you have the woman with the woman on with the crown with the stars and standing on the moon, and the dragon that's threatening her and her child. It's just rich tapestry. It's a modern imagery. It's done 1948. in a chapel that was organized by the abbot Paul-Alain Couturier in France, and it just draws me in. So I'm going quickly through these. The iconic, then, is the sort of next stop after sort of didactic and doxological. And many of you must, I'm sure, know how icons work in the Orthodox Church. I'm not going to be giving a lecture about that tonight, but this one is particularly powerful because it's a two-sided icon and a very large one, and it was meant to be a processional icon. And on one side is the image of the Virgin and Child, and on the back is the image of the Man of Sorrows, or Christ dying on the cross. And of course, the expression on the face of the Virgin tells you already that she knows what the future of her son is. As she tenderly holds him and gestures your vision to look at the child, she is looking out in a worried and anxious expression because she knows what's to come. And so this was a processional icon, and so people would see one side of it in the liturgy, and then they would then see the other as it passed by. But I also compare it to this one, and this is one of many examples of showing a woman at prayer and making her prayer to an image of the Virgin and Child. So images become the focal point for devotional prayer, and that's why I think of these as iconic. And in fact, the portrait, as we see often here, as in this instance, is intended to make us directly confront the face of the holy person. It's not a narrative image, it's actually something interestingly different. It's meant to make us understand and appreciate the presence of the holy person as we are in prayer. Finally, I think this may be the last one I have of this group. This was an image that it's very seared into my own personal memory. I was in Dresden in the early 1990s when the city was still covered with rubble from the Allied bombing of 1945, firebombing of the city, which was devastating to the city of Dresden, and many, many thousands of people were killed. And this is a memorial that's in the side chapel of the Hofkirche church in Dresden, done by a German artist named Friedrich Presse. And this may not be everybody's taste. It's a monolithic-looking sort of statue of a Pieta. But the figure here, the Virgin figure, the upright, is in her arms are bombs. And, of course, the Christ figure, the dead Christ figure, is in some sense not in her lap. The head has fallen off. The most important part of this is what struck me at the time, and I didn't immediately realize until I got closer to it, is this is made of porcelain. It's, of course, the material that is Meissen and Dresden china is made from, and it's very highly fired and very strong, but also, in some interesting way, also very fragile. So the material is an important part of this story. So let us turn from those other uses of art for the church to thinking about how art works as exegesis, as telling our stories and interpreting our sacred stories. I will tell you that at the very beginning of Christian art, we don't really have much Christian art as such, or identifiably so, until the beginning of the 3rd century and into the 4th. And for at least almost 200 years, most of all of what we have that survived is in fact biblical. They're what I call narrative images, as opposed to iconic images, as opposed to purely doxological ones, as opposed to dogmatic images even. Each of these images that we would see in the Christian catacombs of Rome, and you'll see some of these on what we call Christian sarcophagi, tombs, relief carvings on people's tombs, are almost consistently biblical scenes, and dominantly at first from the Old Testament, and gradually more and more New Testament added in. So we have, this is the ceiling of a small burial chamber in the catacomb of Peter and Marcellinus in Rome, And what you see at the center, it's not a great painting, these are not great style in some ways, is the Good Shepherd. And he's often in the center of the ceiling. And surrounding him are images of the story of Jonah. And so we have here, I'm not exactly sure what is up here, it's kind of been lost, but this is actually Jonah being thrown off the ship. And over here, this is probably actually what this would be, with Jonah being swallowed by the monster, Jonah being spit up again by the monster, and Jonah now reclining under the gourd vine. Jonah is probably, after the Good Shepherd, the most common early Christian image. And there might be lots of reasons, and we can probably talk more about that, remembering that we are in a funerary context, and Jonah is a sign of resurrection. So, to sort of put this into some context, I want to think about ways that texts and images work together. And so this is a great image from a medieval book on the cross, where we have the abbot, Rabanus Maurus, venerating the cross, but has a lot of words in the text. He always does this kind of thing. So images may be a substitute for texts, and this is a question I have. We have often talked about Bibles, picture Bibles for the illiterate. I'll come back to that. Images may be amplifications of texts, as in illustrated scriptures. Images may be augmentation of text, not amplification, in that they may beautify and illuminate the scriptures. Images may be interpretations of texts. They can be visual exegeses. And images can finally be expansions on texts. I call visual hermeneutics. So I'm going to give you some examples of these. Let's start with the Children's Illustrated Bible. So often when I'm talking to groups, somebody will remind me or will point out the great line from Pope Gregory the Great, that pictures are the Bibles of the illiterate. And his is a couple of quotes from two letters he wrote to a brother bishop in France. He says, "Pictures are used in churches so those who are ignorant of letters may at least read by seeing on the walls what they cannot read in books." In another letter, he says, "What Scripture does for the literate, a picture does for the illiterate. A picture for them takes the place of reading." I will be very honest with you, I have a lot of trouble with these texts. First of all, it suggests that pictures are only for children, or maybe the people who can't read, and we all kind of hope that's not true. But I do often remind my students that when they got to about the third grade, they took away their picture books and they gave them chapter books, right, with no more pictures, and that meant that they were now growing up. And I think this is a very sad story. But I will trouble that idea, and you'll see how I do, that the pictures are primarily for this purpose. So here's my St. John's Bible image. So this is a great, I think, illustration of an amplification of a text, if not also an augmentation of a text. And so this is the creation frontispiece from the St. John's Bible. And you can see the artist is already interpreting the text in a visual manner. So we have the 7 days of creation done as vertical bars, moving from chaos to rest, moving from the dark to the gold. And in each of these bars is some of the imagery of the story of creation. So we have the water and the animals and the birds and the moon and the sun appearing as this dark blue or black raven flies through the story and knits the whole piece together. And that's a wonderful example, I think, of an amplification of a text. But we also can see often something interesting happening. This is also an amplification of a text from around the beginning of the 15th century. It's the Hulken Bible, and you would see very often the same sort of idea. Here we actually have Noah building the ark on the left, and Noah in the ark on the right, releasing the raven. And one thing that you want to pay attention to is what happens very consistently and almost from the beginning in Christian art when we see God appearing, and we do actually depict God In instances like the creation of Eve, or the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, or the story of appearance of God, the Lord, to Abraham, very often we're going to see that figure depicted as Christ. And so then right away we know that we're doing a Christian interpretation of this text, in that this figure here clearly is Christological. So Christians are insisting that when in the stories of the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, God appears, the person that is, or God speaks to Adam and Eve, God appears to Abraham, it's going to be the second person of the Trinity that does all of that. And so we're going to depict that as Jesus. Now, we can think about whether that's orthodox or not orthodox, and that is a big debate that was actually going on, even about the way that we might depict, artists ought to depict the visitation, the hospitality of Abraham when the three visitors come and have a meal with him under the oak of Mamre in Genesis. And early church fathers really argue about whether, when that, is that the Trinity, or are those angels, and is one member of the Trinity more visible than another, which means that they weren't co-equal and of the same nature, and it's really an interesting problem that artists don't sort of exert themselves about, but the theologians do. And then we sort of have a kind of exegetical presentation in the Biblia Pauperum. So this is a good example right now that I'm using with my students of how Christians interpret the stories in the Hebrew Scriptures or their Old Testament as prefigurations or types of things that are to come. And so one of the most important prefigurations of the crucifixion of Jesus in the Old Testament is actually Abraham's offering of Isaac. And so Isaac becomes a figure or a type of Christ, just as the story in Numbers of Moses raising the serpent on the pole to heal people from serpent bite also becomes, because of the Gospel of John's reference to this, he will be lifted up, as in this case, become important instructional devices for how we teach the stories as prefigurations of Christ. Now, this is not something that Jews would necessarily appreciate, but this is how Christians tell the story, and this is how the Bibles are going to illustrate and guide the reader to make these connections. Similarly, we might see in the same kind of Poor People's Bible, which is what this is called, thinking back on Gregory the Great maybe, you might see the Annunciation to the Virgin in the center, and on the left wing, or the left image, will be, of course, the Adam and Eve receiving the apple, and on the right will be the fleece of Gideon. So we're trying to make sure that people make these connections between the stories, and so they'll juxtapose them. Something to move a little bit more modern. And here's another interpretation of a biblical story from Genesis. And this is George Siegel's monumental sculpture. It's a composition of four figures of Abraham's farewell to Ishmael, his son by Hagar. This is an image that I have seen, and has been very powerful in my own thinking because of the way that the artist has depicted Sarah hovering in the background, looking steely, Hagar looking resigned to her situation, but the tender, tender embrace of Abraham and his firstborn son, Ishmael here, which is interestingly parallel to the way, in fact, that Rembrandt paints the father embracing the prodigal son, if you know that image. So I think that Siegel had in mind a way of telling the story and putting it in modern dress. And I want to give you a little close-up on this. So just to sort of spend a moment of thinking about this imagery and the expression on these faces and the sense of loss and tenderness on the face of the father as he embraces the son. More complicated, And maybe, and I could tell you a little bit about Siegel. Perhaps you have been on the Princeton University campus and seen this, but initially, one of the sculptures that he did, and he does a lot of sculptures of this sort. He often works with white, he often works with plaster, he works with cloth and covering it with plaster. He did a very powerful image of Abraham about to sacrifice his son, and he did it initially as a memorial for the college students killed at Kent State, and it ended up on the Princeton campus because the people at Kent State refused it. And I think this is one of the things we transition into where art becomes interpretive. And it may become social, it may become political, it may be having a message that it wants to impart. This could even be true all the way back in the Renaissance period. So this is one of the most beautiful paintings from the time period by Piero della Francesca. And it's a painting that is titled The Flagellation of Christ. The funny part about this painting, I mean, we could think about it, the perspective, we could think about a lot of beautiful things about this painting, the way that the artist has composed the figures. But if you look at it, you realize that you have to almost have to look twice to find the flagellation of Christ in the painting. And it's in the background. And there's a very mysterious figure here, standing with his back to us. And there's another slightly mysterious figure, which you may decide, well, this could be, perhaps this is Herod, maybe this is Pontius Pilate. Who are these? This is Christ. Why is there a golden statue in the top of this column? And who the heck are these three very large figures in the foreground? And this is a puzzle that has bugged art historians ever since. And there's all sorts of different identifications for these three figures in the front, and in fact, these two figures in the back. So while this might be Pontius Pilate, and this might be Herod, and this is certainly Christ, this also could be this painting was done shortly after 1453, which was when Constantinople fell to the Arab armies. And so there's a sense of the fact that somehow Europe did not come to the assistance of Constantinople, and this may be meant to be I can't say his name, the Emir who is responsible for this attack, and this might have been the Byzantine emperor who is feeling betrayed and left aside. So this may not be the vicious Pontius Pilate, but in fact somebody who's, in a sense, identifying with Christ. And in the front, we don't know. This could be Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus with John the Evangelist, that's sometimes identified that way, or these might be three men who are contemporaries of Piero and were caught up in the claim of and I'll say an insurrection, I can't do it right now, the betrayal of the mayor of the city, or the doge of the area. So it may be about innocent suffering, it may be about a lot of things are going on in this image, and we don't really know. We do suspect it has a contemporary message that we are still trying to unlock. So, some questions. Is art, more or less visual art, more or less reliable or accurate than text? Is it more open to subjective personal interpretation, or more likely to be heretical? I get asked this all the time, and I have to remind people that texts are also open documents, and they're interpreted, and so they can be interpreted in ways that could be heretical. They can be interpreted in ways that are personal, and in that way, they're doing exactly the same thing. Another question. Can images be more effective at communicating than words? Are they aids to memory? Because we store our memories often visually, I think there's something true about that. In the years of teaching Christian theology, the more I can illustrate with pictures, the more effective sometimes my speeches, my lectures will become. I remember in the first years of teaching atonement theory, the ways that Christ's death is salvific for people, I then finally kind of keyed it to different kinds of crucifixion images. Christus as a victor over death and Satan, Christ is the sufferer and the one who's paying the ransom for the many, and so forth. And I found that my students actually began to draw in their final exam books to show me what they were thinking about. I think it's a wonderful moment of thinking about how powerful images are for us, especially in this new generation when images are everywhere around us. This question is more vexing for me. Can art ever be literal? The text doesn't give us enough information for that. Artists, and then, let's just say, are artists actually bound to be historically accurate? I get a lot of questions about why we don't show Jesus or the Virgin Mary as first-century Palestinian people. And I'm thinking, well, that's because that's not what artists are doing. That's not what their mission is. Their mission is not to be literal or historically accurate. It's to do something completely different, and you're going to see some of these in a minute. So, how does visual art communicate? How are images like and not like texts? Are words, in fact, not mediated by images? And can images sometimes take the place of words, as in pictographs, icons, apps, if you want? How is viewing different from reading or being read to? We don't get it sequentially. We read from left to right, beginning, middle, and end. We don't look at images that way, at least still images. I'm not talking about movies or graphic novels, but I'm thinking about the fact that images are looked at in a different way. You can take a snapshot or a long gaze, slow looking. But your eye moves around in different ways and lands on different things and attends to various things. It doesn't move in a sequential manner. This one is really important to me. Do you need to know the story for the image to make sense or for you to decode it? Images are not self-explanatory. This shocks my art history friends sometimes, because I really think that images need to require somebody to train people about how to look at them. You wouldn't necessarily know what's what until somebody gives you some help. So images then maybe are often and need to be supplemented by labels or explanations or captions. We condition the gaze. Any docent in an art museum knows that and knows the positive and the negative sides of that. You can condition people to miss, and they miss a lot of things if you do too much of that. And you don't let them find things for themselves. We do make our own mental images when we read and hear stories, and we all know the instances when we feel disappointed when Harry Potter didn't look like that in my mind, or the movie didn't do the justice to the way I remember that book. And finally, what difference it makes where we see and when we see and who we are and what our contexts and cultures are when we view and experience art. We bring ourselves to it. We bring our situations, our circumstances, our cultures, our expectations, our disappointments to the images all the time. And there's no way I can know what anybody else sees in an image. And that may change from day to day. And we all know that's true. So, what does the viewer bring to the work? Religious background, knowledge, cultural forces, they all impact on the meaning-making process, and it's important to be self-aware of those. Much to say about this. I'm running through a lot very quickly, but I'm trying to strike some notes about thinking about how an artist makes an image, and how do they do it. And I'm going to pass by this slide pretty quickly because time is flying, but I want to get to this one. Elements of visual grammar. So much of my life was spent as an art major in college, and I went to a professional art school after divinity school. And this woman's painting reminds me very much of myself. When I was assigned by my art teacher in my illustration program in New York to illustrate the creation story from Genesis, I think he decided he was going to give me a challenge. And I spent a crazy wild weekend with big rolls of butcher paper, scrawling all over them, writing words, and just making pictures. And somehow I found this image on Google Images, and I thought, that's me. So an artist, first of all, has to choose the moment. It's not obvious which moment to choose in an image. You have to, in the story, you have to select the moment. And then you have to compose it. You have to decide how many figures, what are their relationship, where are we going to put them, in what context, how am I going to light them, what kinds of colors and paint and materials am I going to use. Design, they have to have costumes, they have to have clothes. The Bible doesn't tell us what the Virgin Mary was wearing when that angel came, but you've got to put clothes on her, so what is she going to be wearing? Is it going to be blue? Well, probably. You have a perspective from above and beyond and below and straight on. Are you going to be close up? Are you going to be standing back? Painting techniques, materials, signs and symbols, even text can go into this process. An artist has a lot of tools to work with, and we have to pay attention to how those work. So this is a quick example of juxtaposition. This is a 4th century sarcophagus. It's in the Vatican Museum, and somehow the artist decided to put a naked Daniel next to Christ raising Lazarus from the dead. Why? Because Daniel is also a sign of resurrection. Daniel is a figure of resurrection. He comes out of his tomb in the morning, right? And Darius sees him and says, "What are you doing alive, coming out of your lion's den?" And so the raising of Lazarus, the raising of Daniel. Also, both of them as types of Jesus' own resurrection. Now, this is a completely different thing. This is a different matter. This is a marriage at Cana painting. And I love it because the artist spent a lot of time thinking about dressing up everybody at the wedding party, what they were eating. He threw in the 2 patrons. You can see patron female, patron male over here. We've got people looking on. We've got servers. And here's Christ over here, and here's his mother. But they're not immediately standing out for us. Maybe what we want to pay attention to is the jars in the foreground. So what is this artist thinking? Certainly this isn't what Cana looked like in the 1st century. The artist wasn't ignorant, he knew that. So he's clothing the people, the bridal party, the couple, and all of the guests in contemporary dress. This is his contemporary dress, okay? So it isn't that he doesn't understand. He's trying to tell us something about the people he knows and about the lives that they're living. Now, we were talking about this one earlier today. This is a very famous painting by Caravaggio, which is in Rome. And I'm talking about the way the artist has clearly used light to make the story and the gesture. So he has 2 there's many, we could talk a whole hour about this painting, but there are 2 things you really want to pay attention to, is the artist's very self-conscious use of light and gesture. So the pointing fingers, me, you, yes, and the light streaming in, which draws our eye in a diagonal sense from Christ all the way to Matthew. And one we could say also, again, dressed in contemporary dress. These are probably gutter snipes, if we can use that word anymore, that Caravaggio knew perfectly well and made a great scandal out of the fact that he made Matthew look like somebody who was kind of a lowlife, playing some kind of gambling game in a tavern. Of course, that is kind of what Matthew is in the story, so in a certain way, he's not necessarily the saintly person that the patron who commissioned this work wanted him to look like. So we have, again, clothing in contemporary dress. How much freedom should artists have, then, to interpret the text, to go beyond the text, to convey a new or challenging message? This is a Pieta done by a Jewish man who is actually reflecting on the dead of the Second World War. Thinking back on my Pieta in Dresden, I've got way too many slides here, so I'm going to go fast through this. This is a fun one, though, for me. These are the 3 Hebrew youths repudiating the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's statue in the book of Daniel. Maybe a very 40 cubits tall golden statue. And this artist already in the 4th century has transposed that story to make it the repudiation of the statue of the emperor, the Roman emperor. So we don't have a golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar. We have actually the bust of the Roman emperor on a plinth. And so this is a reflection on persecution and expectations that Christians were made to sacrifice or give prayers to an image of the emperor and refused to do so. And so they're taking that life story they know and putting it back into the story of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. And there's another instance of it. And that makes me think about this one, which is, I've been told, I don't know if it's true, is Pope Francis's favorite painting. And this is in the Art Institute of Chicago. It has a similar one called the Yellow Crucifixion, but this one is by Marc Chagall, done in 1938, shortly before the Kristallnacht trauma that the Jews of Germany went through. And Chagall is, of course, Jewish. He's an artist, but he used Christian imagery to talk about his own people and the pogroms out of Russia, where he came from. And so he's using a crucifix image in a way that was scandalous to his brother and sister Jews, and in some ways even somewhat scandalous to conservative Christians, I think. But this is a way of interpreting this story in his life. And so that's what, in part, is going on with this beautiful painting. So how do artists establish our traditions? This is going to be fast, but this will be fun. So you probably don't know all of this. Some of you will know this, but we have Bridget of Sweden to thank for the fact that Western images of the Nativity almost always show Mary and Joseph kneeling to the child. This is not how Byzantine artists in the East show the image of the Nativity. Usually Mary is reclining because she's just given birth. But in the West, from the beginning of the 15th century onwards, we almost always see in every creche or nativity scene we have the Virgin and Joseph kneeling, or at least the Virgin. And this is due to Bridget of Sweden's vision, in which she saw this in a trip to Rome around 1400. So I talk about how visions and images, we don't have any reason to think the Bible doesn't tell us this, but this becomes the way our minds now are shaped, especially if we're Western Christians and not Eastern Christians. So, and then we have this wonderful Magi tradition. So Matthew's gospel does not tell us that there were three, doesn't tell us that they had different ages, didn't tell us they were from different races, but that's how artists have gone traditionally to tell the story. That there are three Magi because there were three gifts. They have names which become traditional, but they're not in the Bible. And we have this tradition of one of the Magi being from Africa, one of the Magi being from Asia, and one of them being from Europe, to cover the world, coming of the Gentiles to adore and recognize the true God. And also there are three different ages, old, middle-aged, and youthful. This is a wonderful one of a distance set apart, and here's one we have, which is, I think, absolutely gorgeous, but it's very intimate and close up. And we see the same tradition of these Magi. Finally, three last examples, and I'm really running through these way too fast, but we don't have a whole semester, so I'm doing it fast. How did Cain kill Abel? Well, with a jawbone of an ass, of course. How do we know that? Because Samson did that. And we transpose this story, and so everybody gets to thinking that Cain must have used the jawbone of an ass to kill Abel. And here we have them again and again, even into the modern era. And in fact, Hamlet in Act 4, actually in his graveyard scene, actually speaking to the skull, says something about the jawbone of the ass. So it's become absolutely part of our tradition. Moreover, let's ask, what happened when Paul had his vision on the road to Damascus? Well, he fell off his horse, right? Well, that's not in the book of Acts or in any of Paul's letters. How do we know that? Well, we don't. We just get that from the artists, and that's what happens. We get Paul falling off his horse over and over again. So here is this wonderful another Caravaggio for you from Rome. Very famous painting of Paul having fallen. It's this monumental horse, from the backside besides. And you're thinking, did Paul really have a horse like that? And why are we showing it this way? And last but not least, the Annunciation. The angel almost always comes from the left. We don't really know why, except maybe that has to do with speech. But you see in this one, we have something interesting included, which is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, just as Mary is getting the Annunciation of the conception of her holy child. And so we have this juxtaposition of stories, interpretation of stories, recapitulation. The Virgin is now the new Eve, and she's recapitulating the sin and the disobedience of the first couple. But once more time, we get as we hear here, and we have the Virgin clothed in contemporary dress, contemporary to the artist. And so there's the Virgin Mary seated in this beautiful Dutch dining room with all sorts of symbols. And one has to know these symbols. You have to be able to pick them out. It's a really fun game to do with your students, actually. Well, look at the lily. What does that represent? What does this candle that's been snuffed out represent? What about the book? What about all these details the artist has put in this painting to signal messages to us about who the Virgin is and what's happening here? And you can just about miss this little figure. I don't know if you can see it, and if we have time, I'll show you in a close. This is a tiny little naked baby flying in the window, carrying a cross over his shoulder. And somehow the angel has managed to snuff out Mary's candle because the arrival of the Holy Spirit. Joseph on the right is actually making a mousetrap, which goes all the way back to Augustine's theory about Christ as the mousetrap on the cross. But going back to thinking about whether we need to show the Virgin Mary as a first-century Palestinian woman, Henry Ossawa Tanner did actually try this, and in his lights, looking at his time, he did a painting of the Annunciation to represent Mary as a woman of Eastern origins in a fairly simple setting, and decided that that the angel Gabriel should be this just a beam of light. And last, if we can do the Virgin Mary in a Dutch dining room, we certainly can do the Virgin Mary in saddle shoes. So artists have freedom, and this is really important in my message, to expand on the text, to interpret the text, to tell us more about what the text means to them, to preach to us, maybe in ways that we're not ready to receive, maybe sometimes even wrongly. If art can be wonderful, it also can be bad and can be wrong. And I have to say to you, I think sometimes that happens. So I put it to you that what the artist does, and I have my last little paragraph for you. Artists may intentionally, I hope I got this right, intentionally diverge from their texts, include incongruent elements, commentary on the story. They don't merely illustrate it. At the same time, they can't stray too far from their sources, or they lose their moorings, lose their purpose, which is to engage the narrative as well as to expound upon it. Thank you.
On behalf of everyone, want to thank Dr. Jensen for a really stimulating presentation. Truly opened my eyes, no pun intended. And she has graciously agreed to take our questions. So we have a few minutes for a few questions. And I hope that you have questions for Dr. Jensen.
Hi.
Hi.
One question I was kind of just thinking about throughout your entire presentation was, I guess more so from a theological perspective, do you think artists undergo a certain, I don't want to say spiritual transformation because that sounds really broad, but maybe some sort of pondering or contemplation while creating their work, especially when it seems to divert from something that can be seen as traditional? It's
It's a really important question. it doesn't have a very satisfactory answer. One of the things that I did, my first teaching position was try to develop a program that would train artists and architects in theology. And when I got to Nashville, Tennessee, I decided to do that same kind of program, but I wanted to do it for contemporary Christian music writers. I called it the Johnny Cash School of Sacred Music. I think it's something really important. I don't think it's something that happens as much as it should. At the same time, and one of the things that I think is really sad, and maybe this is not exactly what you're asking, but if I was to say one of the worries that I have is that the church is not using the best artists anymore. Now, that doesn't mean universally. I don't mean there's no great artists that are modern that the church will use. But we buy too much of our stuff from catalogs that are mass-produced materials. And we don't, because I think we fear the modern artist. We don't know what they're going to do, and we're not sure that we're going to like what they do. Well, that's always been true. You know, if we just look back at Caravaggio now, we think, oh, what a great painting, what a wonderful artist. Well, he wasn't actually all that approved of in his time. And so I think certainly this is more true in the East with the training of icon writers, that they are spiritually formed, than it is in the West. And maybe always has been somewhat true. You have characters like artists like Fra Angelico, who is clearly using the arts as his vocation and his ministry, and he was a consecrated friar. But I think what you're asking is a really important question. And what we need is to open up ways of communicating and training artists and appreciating them at the same time. Since the Reformation, so much of art went into the secular realm, right? So we have, and even today, an artist who does particularly Christian, but any religious painting, is sometimes excluded from any galleries. And it's a really troubling situation. So you've touched a nerve. It's a really important question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In order to appreciate the intention of the artist, you mentioned that people should basically be trained to interpret the art. Someone that's not trained, what would be a couple of important factors that they could use to begin that process?
Yeah, and that's something that I hold very important. In the way that, I'm not a particularly good appreciator of modern music, and I know that. I know that somebody could teach me what I should be hearing in a way that I wouldn't hear without some help. And I think this is particularly true of contemporary and non-figurative art or non-pictorial art, that people don't know how to it's not accessible for them. It doesn't, and it's not right away. So I think that, like with anything, it needs time, it needs attention. I would recommend, before you go to looking at great works of art in a museum, maybe you read the catalog. Or, museum curators love to help you. They really, really do. And they will, and people are genuinely interested in trying to reach out. But I think we don't do art training like we used to do so much. Even less with the cutbacks in school curriculum and the costs of things. So I would ask for help. It's the people want to help you. I do think that just a simple matter is that unless you have some knowledge, you don't even know necessarily what you're looking at. So I went to an exhibit with an artist friend of mine of Titian's great paintings at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. She was a godsend. I mean, she helped me see the brush strokes and the paint and the colors, but she also walked me through the whole social circumstances of this paintings by Titian at the time and what happened with that. And I thought, if I didn't know that, I wouldn't have appreciated this as much as I did. So,
you mentioned that, sort of passing that a few times, that a lot of these paintings are requested from like a wealthy patron or something like that. And I'm curious about if there's like any study on the effect of sort of people requesting the same scenes over and over again throughout history because it's just the favorite passage or something that's popular, and if that has like it must have sort of a large effect on the development of like transcendental Christian style in art, right? Or this is
one of the it makes me sort of, I get sort of troubled because people often think that art is for the children or the poor, or they're somehow expressing something that of women in a way that we don't otherwise have access to. And I'm not sure that's true. I think unfortunately, it's a lot of the elite in here. It's expensive. And so somebody who is paying for the painting can probably do some kind of insisting on it's going to look like this. And that maybe certainly was true of the Renaissance. And it's important to keep that in mind as one of the features that we're going to have to pay attention to. What is going on in this painting, and whose values are being held up here. And it's something that Caravaggio was very good at. He sort of took on these commissions, and then he kind of thumbed his noses at the people who were asking him to do things, which made them very angry. But I think it is a really important question about where is whose art are we looking at, and who are we supporting in the work, and are we giving them the materials and the freedom to speak their own truth? And that's probably not always true. I mean, that's just the honest answer, and I'm not happy to give it to you, but I think it's like your question. I think we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, following your presentation, what do you think of the future of art in this contemporary world? Because it keeps on evolving. Following your presentation, we go back to the old age, into the modern world. So I'm curious about what would be your statement for the future of art in this contemporary world, and if it is evolving, do you think it affects our interpretation of art, or does it? Because let's say I'm a modern kind of artist and I want to paint Jesus in my own context. Does it affect the old image of God, or does it reflect against the old image of God in general?
Yes. Again, another very important question. So I'm going to take a chance and be a little bit opinionated here. I worry a lot about people, as much as I love Renaissance painting from Europe, I worry that is where we stop, and that's what people like. And so, wonderful as they are, and I don't want to say anything bad about that, I just think it isn't the end. It isn't what we need to go back to. And so I struggle because it's the kind of default position for so many Western Christians. Catholic, Mormon, Protestant, anybody, right? And so if it doesn't look like that, they don't sort of know how to encounter it. This it comes up often with people from other cultures. So if the Virgin Mary can look like a Dutch lady in a dining room, so can the Virgin Mary look like an Asian woman in Japan. I mean, there is no reason we can't absolutely open our minds to this. Again, that was part of my point about saying we don't have to be so historically literal. What we need to do, in the same way that in in some of the writings of Vatican II about church architecture and design, we have to honor the cultures of the people who are worshiping in these spaces. And it isn't okay to say, oh, well, it has to be an organ and we won't have a mariachi band at any time or place, necessarily, until you give me a reason for that, other than you don't, I mean, organs didn't come along until the 16th century. What were they doing? They were all heretics before that because they didn't have organs? I mean, what? So I really want to push your question and say, yes, if I were in an African situation and I were looking for a crucifix, it would not be a Western European one, for sure. And if I were building a church in Guatemala, it wouldn't be a Gothic architecture that I would choose. This makes some of my friends in the architecture school very unhappy to hear me say this, but I do actually believe that. Beauty isn't contained by one culture or one time or one place, right? That's not what I'm talking about, and I think that's really important.
We just want to say thank you again for what was just a great exchange now following a wonderful lecture. And we are in your debt. We're going to be thinking about these things, and I think amongst ourselves talking about them for some time to come. Thank you for everything. So,
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your questions.
yeah, so great. Friends, thank you so much for being here tonight. This McCarthy Lecture Series comes to you from St. Edward's University, and it is under the auspices of the School of Arts and Humanities, which is led by Dean Sharon Nell. This lecture series will continue in the fall semester with another presentation on the Church and Catholicism in the 21st century. Finally, there is a reception with food and beverages. We invite everyone to join us in the reception area just outside, which begins right now. Please stop, enjoy something delicious, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you and good evening.